So, welcome to our packed talk on Brakeman and Jenkins. We're going to be talking about static analysis for Ruby on Rails. And so I'm Justin Collins. If you search the internet for President Beef, you'll find me on many, many sites. So if you went to the talk this morning, all my information is out there, including musical tastes and things like that.
Yeah, I'm Enzo, and I'm privileged enough to work with him and put up with him. We work at AT&T Interactive, and I've been a software developer for many years, but then I became a security person, security architect in like the last 3 years. So this is one approach that we handle security at the source, right? Literally. So our philosophy here is a light touch, right? We want to use tools to detect the security defects early in the phase, and we want to do that without having a lot of impact on the development workflow. Because we all know that developers are busy. They have a lot of feature requests, and they have deadlines, right? So if we're going to go tell them like, hey, do this thing and do this thing right, and by the way, run this tool and analyze your results, most likely they are going to do that, or they may tell like, I'll do it later. So the approach that we took was that we're gonna run this tool on your end, and you wouldn't even know it. So in fact, we didn't even tell them. We worked with the QA automation guys to build this system. We set up this integrate this with the continuous integration, and we got the results, and we just presented to them like, hey, look at the results. Right, so that's our philosophy behind this light touch, and of course, the touch point comes from Gary McGraw's different touch points in the software security development lifecycle. So, when I started doing this security reviews and penetration testing, and work backwards into architecture, security requirements. But the code review here is number one, right? And it's hard for us to do because you'll see in a minute that we don't have a lot of good tools for writing, for scanning Ruby on Rails applications. So why do we want to do this? Well, this is a different cost curve. You have seen this. This original work was started by Barry Bain at USC. And this particular slide is by Scott Ambler. So basically, the cost goes up. The cost of fixing defects goes up as you go later in the cycle. So what we usually have been doing is application security testing or penetration testing late in the stage. So we want to move this all the way down to like the very beginning. So this is our approach and our tools come in. So what about static analysis and dynamic analysis or the penetration testing? I mean, we all know this. Penetration testing, you actually replicate the production environment. You can scan the entire application stack, including the configuration. But you have to set up. You get the symptoms, not the root causes. You set up the server, and you have to do it during the QA cycle, which is quite late. And you get the incomplete review of the running app. And static analysis, you can do it in the early phases of development as you're writing code or you're checking in code, and you can integrate this into the development workflow. And you don't need to deploy anything because it works with your source code. And the typical drawbacks of static analysis, like you need access to the source code, and your view is limited to the code, not the entire application stack. And both approaches have one thing pretty annoying, that's a false positive, and testing will really get into how we address false positives in our approach. So these are the tools that, there are a lot of tools for C, C++, C#. I wouldn't mention names because this is a OWASP conference, but C#, it goes all the way back to Lint or Valgrind to the freeware tools. A lot of commercial vendors for C#, .NET, and Java. And Ruby, there are some tools for doing static analysis, but they're not particularly for security. Because Ruby being the interpreted language and garbage collector language, you don't have a lot of issues there. They have other issues. And then Ruby on Rails, there was basically no tools, no usable practical tool for finding security defects in the Ruby on Rails code, and that's where Brakeman comes in, and that's where testing comes in.
So if you're using a tool like Brakeman, this is kind of the workflow. You get the latest code, and then you run the tool, and then you look at the results, and then you probably tell somebody about them. But then when the code changes, you do it again, and you do it again over and over again. So, this is what happened to me, basically. I wrote the tool, and then I'm like, oh, I'll run it on the code. Oh, the code changed, now I have to run it again. So, of course, what we really like to do is we'll just relax, and we'll write tools that will tell us when there's a problem. So this is kind of our goal. So Brakeman is the static analysis tool that we have. That's the website. It's free and open source, so you can go download it. So how many of you are Ruby on Rails developers? Don't be shy. Okay. And how many of you are familiar with Ruby on Rails? Yeah, okay. Okay. So the main thing is, if you were going to write a static analysis tool for Ruby, you'd be like, oh man, where do I even start? And if you look on the internet, there are a couple guys who have made some progress in this area, but it's like, oh man, you can almost do anything. So how do I even know where to start? Well, the nice thing is with Ruby on Rails, because they have a very structured approach, and I guess I should say Ruby on Rails is a web framework that runs on Ruby. But because they have this idea of like, well, if you just put things in the normal places, then everything works on defaults. So that makes it easy if you're writing a tool to analyze the programs, because you know, oh, well, the default view for this will be in this file directory in a file named this, so it's very easy to find. So that gives us actually an advantage when we're doing static analysis. So the way Brakeman works is, first, of course, it parses the code. It does some cleanup, some simplification of the abstract syntax tree. And then it looks at the results of that, runs multiple checks on it, and then it generates a report. So here's the list of some of the vulnerabilities it detects, all the standard, basically the standard ones: cross-site scripting, SQL injection, command injection, redirects, file access. Basically, most of the things that you could do statically. And I should point out that as vulnerabilities come out, like in specific versions, we add those in. So it knows if you're running a specific version, it'll say, oh, well, for this version, okay, there was this security problem. So here's an example. This is a template using ERB, the default template language. Here we're saying, please put this query parameter into the page. So for Rails 2.0, this would be a cross-site scripting vulnerability. In Rails 3, they escape by default. So in Rails 3, you would actually have to do a little bit more work and say, please output this without escaping it. So if you were to run Brakeman against code like this, you would get a warning like this. So an escape parameter value, you get the line number, and then you get the code as Brakeman would see it. So another example. So here we're doing a database query, and we're just going to drop this variable right in. And here, so we basically just have a local variable. We're assigning a query parameter to it and dropping it into our SQL statement. So we know this is wrong, right? The Rails developers that raise your hands, right? Okay. So you should be doing a parameterized query. So Brakeman notices this. You'll get a warning like this, and here you can see that the actual value of the variable is what Brakeman will report. So here's a little bit longer example. Here we have we're at the application controller level, so that's like the highest controller on the inheritance hierarchy. we have a method, and we're just going to set the user variable to some user that we get out of the database. So then in our user controller, this is kind of a contrived example, but we're going to have this filter where we call that on any action that we do. So we have an action show, and that will call the set user method before it actually does the show action. So then we have our view, and let's say we like the user to be able to put some HTML into their bio, but we think we stripped out everything that's bad, so we'll just use raw, right? So the basic flow is you're going to go to the user controller, then it's going to go back to the application controller, call that filter, then it's going to go back to the user controller, then it's going to go down to the actual view, and that's where we're going to catch the error. So you'll get a warning, something like this. So here you can see this is the actual value that we put into that user variable. So if you were just looking through your views, or if you were using a tool that, let's say, uses regular expressions to look for problems, it's not going to find this, okay? And you may or may not notice what's going on here. So one more example. This is a model as generated by Rails. So there's nothing in it because it pulls everything from the database. Here is the corresponding controller that it generates. And here you can see it's creating a new user straight from query hash. So how many people are familiar with the mass assignment? Okay, and how many of you are familiar with the issue that this causes? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so this will basically take all the parameter values that you're passing in, and it'll put those directly into the database. So if you're not restricting anything, we'll show an example later. If admin is one of your attributes, then people can just add that into the query parameters, admin true or 1, and now they're admins. So assuming that you're not restricting access, you will get a warning that's like this. So now we have a tool that will... If you use attribute accessible, then you will not get this warning. And if you disabled mass assignment, you will also not get this warning. So now we have the tool that's giving us the warnings, but we're still running it manually. So that's where Jenkins comes in, or formerly Hudson, which is an open source continuous integration server. And basically, it's how many of you use Hudson or Jenkins? Okay, so the reason this slide is so generic is because you can almost do anything with it. But in general, you're going to monitor some conditions. In our case, a source code repository. When certain things happen, someone checks in some code, we'll run some jobs against it, and then we'll report some results. So in our case, that would be, okay, someone commits some code, we're going to run Brakeman, and then we're going to return some results. So we actually have a plugin that integrates with another plugin to give you these nice graphs. And it basically works like I said. So it'll run Brakeman against the code, it'll grab all the warnings, and then you'll get these nice graphs out of it. So we'll show you in more detail in the demo, but you get something like this, right? Warnings, what type of warnings you get, what kind of distribution of high, medium, and low confidence levels, which we'll talk about in a little bit. If you want to use Brakeman, this is how easy it is. If you are a Ruby person, you're probably familiar with installing gems. You go to your Rails application and you run Brakeman. Of course, there's a lot of other options that you can add on, but if you just want to try it out, this is all it takes to run it. And we have some resources which can find later when they post the slides, I assume. And now we're going to go to the demo. Alright, so I'm going to talk and Tim is going to type. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new Rails application. And this is using Rails 3 something, 3.09, something like that. So if we just run Brakeman, see it notices it's Rails 3, and this is kind of the output you'll get, and you'll see it didn't find anything. If this was a Rails 2 application, you actually would get at least one warning, which would be the default or else warning, but they disabled that in Rails 3, so we get nothing. So now we're going to turn this into a Git repo, so we can use it with Jenkins. So we've initialized it, added all the files, and we do a commit. Alright, so now if we go to Jenkins or Hudson, as this is labeled, we're going to create a new job. This is like sort of like the bare minimum setup that you need to do. So freestyle software project. It's running locally, that's why it's kind of slow. Also, it's Java, that's also why it's kind of slow. Alright, so now we're going to point it to, no, go scroll down. It normally wouldn't look this, squished together. This is just so you guys can see it. So we're going to put in the file, the path to our repository. Did you write that down? You got to start with file. Just say demo app set. All right. And then we're going to go down. No, just like that. So the plugin itself will not run Brakeman for you because there's too many different ways you could have Brakeman installed depending on your Ruby setup. So all you have, so this is like the simplest case. If you have Ruby just kind of installed default way and the gems installed, if you go to add build step and execute shell, and then you can just run Brakeman, and the output is sort of a special format just for this plugin. -o Brakeman -output .tabs. So the tabs extension is like to get this kind of tab delimited output. That's it. So then we go down, and once you install the plugin, there will be this publish Brakeman warnings option, and you can see the default file is what we put in, just coincidentally. And then that's all we have to do. You can save it. So kind of where the tricky part comes in is so Jenkins is usually installed on a server somewhere, and then sometimes the jobs are, so you want to do build now. Sometimes the jobs are run on like slave machines, so sometimes the tricky part is just getting Brakeman to run in that shell script. Just let it run. So if you refresh the page, okay, so we accidentally had two builds run, but we'll see the graph later. Can you go back to the left and to click on one of the builds? So down at the bottom, you'll see Brakeman vulnerability results. 0 warnings. No new warnings. apparently since yesterday. Alright, so you want to go back. And we're just going to run some basic scaffolding generation. So we're going to have a user, the name, and password, and then just for fun, an admin flag.
By the way, this is not the recommended way of doing your own authentication.
Alright, so it's generated some new files. We're going to add them to the repository and commit them. So normally what you would do is you would set up Hudson or Jenkins to pull your repository. And it's basically like, it's just like a cron job kind of thing. It's part of the job when you set it up, but we found out when doing demos, you don't actually want it to be doing that. So we'll manually go back and run another build. I have to go back. Back to project. No. Alright, so we'll do another new build. So for Hudson or Jenkins, it actually will keep a local copy of your code. So when you change code, it'll actually it'll do like an SVN update or git pull. So you're only pulling the changes. So now you can see we have 3 new warnings. Yeah, let's go ahead and look at them. So you get kind of this again, it'll look better when it's not on a huge screen. So you can see there's some warnings about these files. If you go to details, so you can see we have unprotected mass assignment, possibly an unprotected redirect. You see the priority on that's low because it's probably not really a problem. And then you can see we have a general warning that mass assignment was not restricted using attribute accessible. So if we go to the mass assignment, if we click on the file name there, we'll actually get right in the code highlighted where that error came from, or where that warning came from. So we have more time. Yeah. So we'll run, we'll show you guys the HTML output as well against a Rails 2 application. And this is actually one of the applications that Brakeman runs its automated tests against. So you'll see a lot more warnings, and they'll be really kind of goofy, but this will give you an idea of what you get with the HTML report. So you get some basic information. You can see the Rails version 2.3.11, all the checks that were run. You can see we have 36 security warnings, 29 of which are high confidence warnings. So can you guys see that? Or can you make it a little bit bigger? Control Shift plus. Okay. So you can see command injection. We detected that you're devaluing parameters. A general warning about default routes. If you click on one of the warnings, you'll see a little code snippet that's showing you where in a little piece of code, this is where the warning came from. Any particular warnings that you guys might be interested in? Cross-site scripting. Okay. So if you scroll down, the warnings for views are in another section. You can see We aren't protecting against cross-site request forgery. A little bit lower. Okay, so now we're into the cross-site scripting. These are warnings generated from the views, as you can see. So here we're outputting some cookies. If you go on the one right above that. So here you can see an example where the parameters are actually coming in from a variable from who knows where, probably the controller. So what you see from Brakeman is, okay, you're outputting params unsafe input. What you see in the actual code is just some variable, literally called some variable. And then you can see right below it, in the code, it's calling escape once. So you will not get a warning about that because Brakeman knows that you're escaping the code, or escaping the user input. Anything else you guys might be interested in? Yes?
Does it look for, so the default Ruby escaping doesn't escape single quotes? So if you have like HTML attributes and single quotes, you can escape out of those, even with the default H function?
It doesn't escape single quote. Oh, right, because it's just HTML escape.
Right, yeah. So if it's in like an attribute context with single quotes, I'm just wondering if you guys look at that special case. It's kind of a common case.
No, we don't, because it's not actually, Brakeman wouldn't actually know that you're in that context. But if you, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so that's something that possibly we could add later. Any other questions? Questions about how it works or things that may or may not find? Yes?
What's the biggest program for?
So there is, well, obviously we use it internally, but there is a program which I don't know exactly if we forked it and then re-open sourced it, or if we open sourced it. It's called Inventory without an I. And there's like hundreds of models and hundreds of views, and just, it's huge. And we run it against that. Size is not really an issue unless you ran out of RAM. It's not going to, so one thing, it's not going to look in stuff that is sort of outside of the usual Rails stack. So it doesn't really look in like external libraries or anything like that. The main thing that takes up time is for every action, it'll actually generate a new view using the variables from that action. So that's what takes up most of the time and resources. So even against that, with hundreds of models and hundreds of views and hundreds, I think there might even be hundreds of controllers, I'm not sure. It takes a few minutes to run, so it's still pretty quick. And if you're doing it with continuous integration, I mean, you won't notice that it takes a few minutes. Any other question? Yeah?
Will it run under JRuby?
It will run under JRuby, yes. It will also run under the latest Rubinius, and probably other places. It'll run with 1.9, 1.8. You might have to use 1.87, but no, it'll work with 1.86 too, because we had an application that was using Ruby Enterprise Edition. Any other questions? So one thing that you should check out, which is on our resources slide, and it was turned into a, so it was turned into an OWASP project, which is the Ruby on Rails security guide. It is out of date. It's basically for Rails 2, but I've actually seen it recommended places as a general web security guide. It's that good. So if you haven't checked it out yet, it's on the Ruby on Rails guides page, or you can just search for it. Unfortunately, I don't remember the author's name, But it's a really good resource. It talks about, session hijacking and all sorts of interesting things, not just related to Rails. All right, thank you guys.
Yeah, we'd like to hear your feedback and try that out.
Yeah, run it, download it, run it, and then file bugs.